What is going on, CaneSport? Izubee Charles, joined by Stephen Wagner for another Inside Canes Recruiting podcast. Stephen, we have a lot to talk about on this show, but obviously going to talk about the biggest target in that 2026 class, and that is five-star offensive tackle Jackson Cantwell. It's coming down to the wire in his recruitment as he's set to commit in the next week and a half. And Stephen, we all know Oregon got that recent visit. We all know Georgia has that last visit, but the Miami Hurricanes snuck in and got a sneaky visit in as Alex Mirabal made his way to Missouri to go check out on the five-star prospect. You've been all over this recruitment. I had the chance to actually speak with Jackson after he had the chance to sit down with Coach Mirabal and his entire family. So, what's the latest with Jackson Cantwell, and just how impactful do you think this recent visit was for the Hurricanes?
Yeah, I feel like we can't go a day without talking about Jackson Canwell, and honestly, it's warranted. If Miami has a legitimate shot with the number one prospect in the country, we're going to be on that like white on rice. Miami they still very much feel like they're in the picture. I talked to some people last week. They still felt like Miami could absolutely get him. Even though obviously everyone saw the RPM to Georgia, it hasn't been a secret that Georgia's been in the mix for a really, really long time. They've been recruiting him really hard for a really long time. But Alex Mirabal still wanted to get one final in-person visit with Cantwell and his family. So he drove up to Nixon, Missouri last night. Saw Cantwell in person in his hometown. And basically what Cantwell said was he asked every single question he could think of. Cantwell, that is. Cantwell asked Mirabal every single question that he could think of. He wanted to leave absolutely no stone unturned. He wanted to make sure he had the absolute most information he could possibly have about Miami before he goes ahead and makes this decision. We felt really confident about the position that Miami was in about a month ago whenever he said that he felt like he was kind of starting to get near the end of the process and that he might be ready to commit soon. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit since then because at first he felt like he was getting pretty close to committing. Then he announces that he's going to commit April 30th. Then he announces that he's going to take an official visit to Oregon right before he commits. And it still feels like kind of a Miami-Oregon battle, and everyone's leaning toward Miami. And then after that, he comes out and says, "Hang on, guys, pump the brakes. I'm actually going to commit 2 weeks later on May 13th. I want to go see Georgia one more time too," which obviously tells us that Georgia has made one heck of a push. The longer that this drags out, the more pessimistic I am about Miami's chances. It really felt like it was one of those things where if Miami was able to capitalize very quickly, whenever he announced that he was nearing the end of his process, if he announced that on April 10th and Miami was able to get him to want to make a decision on April 15th, I probably would have put a crystal ball in for Miami, or excuse me, an RPM in for Miami. But the fact that these schools keep convincing him to extend and extend and extend his deadline makes me think that right now there's too many schools that really have a chance right now. Jackson said that he wants to go with his gut at the end of the day, or excuse me, he will go with his gut at the end of the day. Right now, if I had to guess, I would probably say that that's Georgia. Georgia has been recruiting him for the longest of these schools. They were the first to offer him of these schools. We're sitting here in May of 2025. Georgia got on him back in July of 2023. They've recruited him very hard for a very long time. Miami is recruiting him the hardest of the finalists. Ohio State's also a finalist. I really don't consider Ohio State, that really in the mix, just because we haven't heard, a ton of buzz around them to this point. But I really do, kind of feel like this could be starting to slip away from Miami. I just really think that Georgia at the end of the day is going to kind of be what his gut tells him. That's kind of my analysis of the situation. I think he's going to end up a dog.
Yeah, so Jackson Gale, obviously, this is a recruitment, like Steven said, we will continue to cover until, he announced that commitment, until he, signs that, national letter of intent. But this was kind of a topic that we've talked about a lot these last few weeks. And obviously, because Miami's, top target in that 2026 class, obviously, he's a five-star prospect, but he's a guy that Miami believes he can come in and plug and play and be that tackle for the Canes for the future. And obviously, you never want to lose out on a prospect like that. And you saw Coach Mirabal, make that kind of last ditch effort to kind of get Miami's final say in that. Obviously, taking those visits to Oregon and Georgia, didn't play too well in favor for Miami, but this one's going to be one that we find out in about a week's time. So we'll continue to cover the situation. But Stephen had a great update with Canwell fresh off that meeting with Coach Mirabal. So make sure to check that out. And Stephen, Coach Mirabal is not going to be the only coach on the road over the next few days. Actually, Miami running back coach Matt Merritt went up to Georgia to check in on one of Miami's top running back targets, Jay Lamar. And Stephen, he's a guy that's visited Coral Gables a few times this spring. Obviously, he's a cousin of Nikar and has a really good relationship with new Miami linebacker signing out of the portal, Kamal Barnes. So how crucial, how big do you think Miami is a player in Jay Lamar's recruitment, especially seeing Coach Matt Merritt make that way up to Georgia to go check up on him again?
Jay's a guy who's really tried to hold his cards, pretty close to the chest, but I really do feel like Miami is right there for him. Everyone that I've spoken to has indicated that, yeah, they do still feel pretty good about their chances. And, someone told me, he decided, Jay likes Miami enough that he wanted to make 2 multi-day unofficial visits, from Georgia to Miami this spring on his own dime. He'll also obviously be back for an official visit before he probably ends up committing this summer. I mean, Miami has been all over this kid for such a long time. And it really is paying off. Miami offered him, I think, back last July, or excuse me, not last July. I think it was actually October or November, because it was, I remember now it was in the fall, but still, Miami's been making a pretty good effort for him for a while. Canes are absolutely in that mix. It kind of felt like for a little while it was a Miami-Clemson battle. Some people thought Georgia was going to get him for a little while. Then it seemed like Georgia kind of fell off. I really do think Miami's going to have an awesome chance here. And I'm saying this now because I know people are going to ask the question, what if Jay Lamar wants to commit to Miami? Then what happens to Derek Cooper? I do not know, but I think that Miami would probably look at potentially taking 3 backs in the cycle. I really, really do think that if Miami were to get Javian Mallory and Jay Lamar, and then they keep chipping away at Cooper, and eventually they're able to get Cooper to the point where he wants to commit to Miami, I really do think they would take him. Because that was kind of, what Miami was looking at back in the 2024 cycle whenever they landed Kevin Riley, they had Chris Wheatley-Humphrey, and they were also trying to flip Jordan Lyle. If Kevin Riley and Jordan Lyle were both totally okay with coming to Miami, Miami probably would have ended up with 3 backs. It turned out that wasn't the case, and Kevin Riley decided to go ahead and flip to Alabama. But I think that absolutely would have been a conversation that Miami would have had. Is Kevin Riley, or are Kevin Riley and Jordan Lyle, can we find a way, to make this thing work? I think Miami would absolutely have the same conversation about Jay Lamar and Derek Cooper, because, yeah, obviously, Cooper's been, the number 1 guy on their board, and, we talk about Cooper this, Cooper that, all the freaking time. I don't think enough people, realize just how high Jay Lamar is on their board. Miami absolutely freaking loves this kid. I had one source tell me that, they really do believe that Jay Lamar might have the highest ceiling of anyone in this cycle, or of any running back in this cycle. They think he's an absolute baller. He comes from, he comes from a very good system in Colquitt County. He has ties to Miami. Obviously his cousin being Nikar, and he plays against a very high level of competition, and he is extremely productive. I think he's as well-rounded a back as Miami is going after right now. I think, he's kind of, more of the steady, consistent mold that Miami looks for. And then I think Derek Cooper is more of, the explosive home run hitter who can take one to the house at any moment. But Miami would absolutely like to get either of them. And if both of them wanted to come, I think Miami probably has a conversation about taking both.
Yeah, imagine that, a running back class with Jay Lamar, Derek Cooper, and Jaden Mallory. And Those two running backs are all great. And I actually had the chance to, watch Javian this past weekend, and boy, was I impressed with not only him, but that entire West Boca High School squad. Last season, they won a state title without Javian Mallory. He missed that second half of the season. And then I went out there to just go check him out, check out JV and some of the other prospects they have. And, kudos and shout outs to, head coach Dylan Potts and those guys from, turning a program that was one of the worst programs in the state of Florida to what looks like one of the best programs, not only in South Florida, but the entire state of Florida. And watching JV, he is such a big back. He looks like he can, play college football right now, and just how patient he is when he's running the ball. And, they had him running the Wildcat. He was throwing touchdowns. He was running people over. Awesome in the passing game as well. They had him lined up at slot, catching screens, making guys miss. He's a guy that I'm really excited about. And, we've talked about a little bit how he, dealt with some injuries in the past, but when he's fully healthy, which he is right now, he's an exciting player to watch. And I'm super excited for you guys to see, a lot more of him. If you haven't, make sure to go check out all the stuff that we post on Instagram and TikTok about Jaden Mallory and a lot of the other guys we're seeing this spring. So make sure to check that out. But just wanted to add in that little piece of Jaden Mallory, how good of a prospect I think he has the potential to be if everything lines up. And him in that backfield behind that Miami offensive line would be a great look for the Hurricanes in the future. But Stephen, we're going to move on from the high school guys and kind of talk about Miami's transfer portal haul. Obviously they addressed some issues. One being wide receiver, linebacker as well. Got a new kicker and Brett Auburn, but we're just going to kind of run through Miami's commits from the transfer portal right now, kind of touch on a few of those guys. Start at wide receiver, like I mentioned. They've added Tony Johnson from Cincinnati, Keelan Marion from BYU, Jacoby Thomas at safety from Tennessee, running back Shamar Brown out of North Dakota State, linebacker Kamal Barner from NC State, and then Bert Albert from Texas. Steven, we'll start on the offensive side of the ball. Shamar Brown winning the Jerry Rice Award, the same award that Cam Ward won, being the best freshman in FCS. Just adding that type of running back, I had the chance to speak with his coach. Said he's one of the most consistent guys you'll get at that position, but comes with a lot of productivity. Adding him to a backfield with Mark Fletcher and Jordan Lau. How important do you think that addition was for the Canes? Landing a guy like Shamar Brown.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's be honest. Miami already had Jordan Lyle and Mark Fletcher. Miami was in the market to try to find an RB3. I'll be honest. After looking at his tape, I don't see how he doesn't get some meaningful touches this season. I mean, just looking at what Mark Fletcher's gone through the last couple of years, he's probably going to get banged up at some point. He will probably miss a couple of games, and it'll probably end up being Jordan Lyle and Shamar Brown. Who knows? Maybe Chris Wheatley Humphrey or Gerard Pringle's able to get some snaps here or there, but I think Shamar Brown's absolutely going to have his opportunities this fall. I think he's really going to impress some people. I mean, looking at his tape, he's basically like an FCS version of Mark Fletcher. Maybe a little bit of a smaller build, but great patience behind the line of scrimmage, great anticipation, really fantastic vision, and has the speed to break away if he's able to get into the open field. Although, by no means would I consider him, one of these guys who, has the potential to take it to the house, every single time. I look at him more as, one of these guys who can consistently turn, 3 yards into 4 yards or, 4 yards into 6 yards, just find ways to kind of keep the sticks moving. Has experience playing behind an elite offensive line at North Dakota State on the FCS level that, kind of has that talent gap over its opponents. So, I think obviously that's going to be one thing that's really going to help him fit in at Miami, because obviously, this is probably going to be the best offensive line that Mario Cristobal's had since he's been here. And I think it's going to allow them to be really creative with the way that they run the ball. With the amount that North Dakota State would get under center and, the amount that they would, line up in these single back formations, I kind of feel like he'll probably be at his best out of the pistol, kind of whenever he has, an opportunity to get a full head of steam and, maybe better see some of those cutback lanes and have more cutback opportunities that would kind of be, more natural movements for him. I really do think that he's going to surprise some people. They wanted an RB3. I'll be honest. I think they got more of an RB2, and heck, on some Power 5 teams, I think he could probably be a starter. I mean, Cal really did make one heck of a run at him, and I know obviously people will say, well, that's Cal. Cal goes 500 and gets to a bowl game, and they say, man, that was a pretty good season, huh? But that is a Power 5 program that honestly probably should have beat Miami last year. And they were legitimately targeting him as their RB1. I really do think there are probably half the programs in Power Four he probably could have ended up starting at. But obviously it's not the way that it worked out. But I really do think he's going to have an opportunity to make a difference.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that he, chose Miami. Like you mentioned, had the opportunity to be running back one at Cal, a program that lost every single, scholarship running back they had in the transfer portal. And then his hometown school, Nebraska, I spoke with his head coach, over there at Creighton Prep in Omaha, and he kind of, said, hey, Nebraska's looking for a running back, and Shamar Brown is a guy that really fits their mold. And I was leaning towards him going to be a Husker, making that reunion home, but after I spoke with him after his official visit, one thing that kind of stood out to me was when I asked him, "Hey, obviously Mark Fletcher and Jordan Lau are both featured backs in this running back room right now. Just what are your thoughts on that?" And he said, "Hey, the greats did it back in the day for Miami. Why can't we?" And after he said that, I was like, "Okay, this kid has that kind of mindset of wanting to better himself, wanting to prove himself at the Power Five level or Power Four level." My bad. And it was just pretty cool to see them. Like you mentioned, I don't think he's going to be a running back three or slot as that. I think he can push for that RB2 role. And, we saw last year how many different running backs Miami used, with Damian Martinez, with Jordan Lau, with Chris Woody, have myself excited to see how that turns out. And then the two wide receivers, Stevens. What are your quick thoughts about Johnson and Marion coming from the Big 12, Cincinnati and BYU?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's address the elephant in the room. Miami was not able to get that true wide receiver one in the spring portal like they were really hoping to. And you look at the options that were in the portal at receiver, they were pretty slim pickings. There really wasn't, there was really only Trevor Pena who really stood out as one of those true free agents, one of those guys where, pretty much any team in America can make a run at him and he'll probably end up starting there. Outside of that, I mean, Keelan Marion, probably next best option. Tony Johnson, kind of brings, experience and reliability. But both of these guys are probably more like depth fillers. They're, I would probably be surprised if we end up seeing, one of them emerging and developing into a true wide receiver one. But I mean, it's not Miami's fault that, the pickings were pretty slim in the spring portal. They knew that, they were probably going to, have to, make a pretty serious run at, one of these top receiver prospects. And they were budgeted to, really throw some dough at, some of these top receiver prospects, or I guess I shouldn't say that. They were positioned to be able to really throw some NIL money at these receiver prospects. But at the end of the day, Miami just it didn't work out. The guys weren't there. It's probably kind of on Miami a little bit, for being in the position that they were, where they realized that in the spring, we are going to have to go add more guys. Hopefully you're able to get that done in the winter portal window whenever the options are much much deeper, or maybe you're even able to get it in. Maybe you're even able to get it in high school recruiting. But it is what it is. There's no reason to apologize for it. But this is just kind of the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I agree with you with kind of the slim picking thing, but those two guys, Tony Johnson and Keelan Marion, obviously produced at the Power Five level in the Big 12. Keelan Marion being named a first team All American in that return game, and I think he's going to be a big impact for Miami in that special teams because these last few years really haven't seen that pop since I think Brashard Smith had a kick return 2 years ago, but I think he's going to bring that dynamic, playmaking ability in the return game. So excited to see what those guys can do. And Miami needed some veterans in that receiver room with C.J. Daniels being the only senior, and everyone else pretty much being redshirt sophomores and freshmen. So added some depth to that room, added some experience, which I think was absolutely crucial. And then to wrap up, kind of the transport additions, we'll talk about Jacoby Thomas and Kamal Barner from NC State. I really like Thomas. Obviously, the AJ Halsey situation happened with him asking for all this money and all this stuff, and no one really knows what happened. A lot of speculation, but he ended up at LSU. Miami got Jacoby Thomas, also added a linebacker. Just what are your thoughts on those two additions to the defensive side of the ball for the Canes?
Yeah, well, another situation where let's be honest with ourselves. Jacoby Thomas and AJ Halsey. AJ Halsey was the guy that they really freaking wanted, and it didn't happen for one reason or another. Miami wasn't able to to close the deal. We really, really, really felt like there was a point where he was probably going to end up a Hurricane. Obviously, that didn't happen. He's going to go. He's going to play for the Tigers next year. Is what it is. They did get Jacoby Thomas though, who I think is going to be a really, really consistent player. Who I think a lot like Jamar Brown is probably going to surprise some people. And, he has a ton of experience, really reliable. I think he's a very, very good tackling safety. Doesn't miss a ton of tackles, especially in the open field. Experienced enough that he's seen all kinds of offenses. He knows every coverage. He really does. Bring, I think, probably a little bit of a calming presence to a safety room that's going to be pretty young outside of the starters. You look at guys like Dylan Day or Markeith Williams, who neither of them have really that much starting experience. Dylan Day was really just running down on kickoffs last year. Markeith Williams, definitely earned reps, but I never really felt like there was a point where Miami was leaning on him to be the guy in the secondary or anything like that. Who knows? Maybe we even see Amari Wallace here or there, but Miami really does need that experience in the secondary. I do think that adding Thomas is something that they really needed to do. I think that this is a good pickup. It's not incredible, but I do think it's a good pickup.
Yeah, excited to see, how Miami also closes out the transfer portal. A few names, still on the board. Gregory Smith, the third transfer from Florida. Mohamed Toure, the linebacker from Rutgers that, played his best football under Corey Heatherman in 2023. And some of you remember kind of, balled out against Miami in that Pinstripe Bowl where Ja'Cory Brown started at quarterback. But another linebacker that they're looking to add to that room potentially. And a new name, Arkansas State defensive lineman Jaquan McGinney, is a guy that was reportedly received some interest in Miami. So Hurricanes looking to add a few more guys in that transfer portal before things are all said and done. And obviously, you wanted Miami to land these big whales, but if we're being honest, there wasn't that many huge guys available in the portal. And I think Miami added the pieces that they needed to and kind of routed out this 2025 roster. I'm excited to see what these guys do, in the upcoming fall. And well, that'll be all that we have for this episode of Inside Canes Recruiting. If you like this show, leave a big thumbs up on YouTube. And if you're not already subscribed, head to CaneSport.com and join our CaneSport family where we talk everything Miami Hurricanes athletics. So for Stephen Wagner, I'm Izubee Charles. Thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day.